Okay, we are live on episode 16 of Fair Go Basic Income Discussion Group. This is the federal election special. In Australia, we have an election coming up on the weekend, and we are lucky enough to have multiple candidates running on basic income or basic income-like policies. We've got three of them joining us tonight. We've got Tim Hollo from the Greens, who's running for a seat in the lower house in Canberra. We've got Andrea Leong, who is running for the Fusion Party in the Senate, for the Senate of New South Wales, and Paul Ross, who is an independent candidate, but also a member of the Citizens Dividend organisation and a long-time basic income advocate. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to go to you in alphabetical order by first name. Andrea, why don't you give us a 5-minute version of who the Fusion Party are, what your basic income policy is, and we're going to go to all three candidates and then open the field for questions. As soon as you think of a question, put your hand up, and I'll try and come to people in the order that they put their hands up. Andrea, take us away, please.
Thank you very much, Austin. So the Fusion Party is, you'll notice that we're a new party on the ballot this time around, but you might be aware of some of the names that are incorporated into the full name, which is Fusion, Science, Pirate, Secular, Climate Emergency. So the Science Party and the Pirate Party, and Secular and Climate Emergency are all parties that have merged together to form Fusion. In the lead up to this election, people say, why don't all the small parties work together? So we did, and we formed a larger party. And the Science Party and the Pirate Party both had broad platforms that were actually really very similar. If you look at our logo, it's some overlapping circles, which represents a Venn diagram, actually. The Secular Party and Climate Emergency Action Alliance bringing their specialist focuses to the policy platform, but the Pirate Party and Science Party had some really a lot of overlap, even though we sort of had different feels. The Pirate Party were coming from a very civil libertarian angle and the rights of the individual, while also enriching culture and society. And the Science Party was probably coming from a more techno-optimist, eco-modernist perspective, realizing that we have to fix problems of the environment and implement policies that are good for the environment and good for people. So one thing that is common in our platforms was the need for a more humane welfare system. We recognise that it's as cruel as it is absurd to punish people for not having a job by making them jump through hoops to gain income support. The system that we have now, New Start, was renamed to Job Seeker, which is dehumanizing in itself, and that was done during a pandemic, while more people than ever before were applying for it. So yeah, changing the already labyrinthine administrative system to try and get income support when people most needed it. So the Fusion Party has settled on a UBI policy, a universal basic income. So we would like to see implemented a policy of every adult citizen being afforded an automatic payment above the poverty line, which is tax-free, and then other income from work is taxed on top of that. And one of the great benefits of that is, well, two of the great benefits of that system, as I'm sure many people here are aware, is that it removes the stigma associated and the hoops that have to be jumped through with welfare in our current system, and also smooths out the lumpiness that you get at the lower end of the income scale, where you might have some income support and then you find work, and the amount that you get paid, a large proportion of that is lost in terms of the income support you get paid. So you're actually not that much better off for having found that paid work. Austin, are you
I'm muted. I was cutting in. I was going to say, I believe it's 75 cents on the dollar when you first start work. When you earn above a very low threshold, they're taxing you as much as 75 cents on the dollar. Or the welfare is withdrawn at that rate.
Yeah, and that's certainly not the effective tax rates that you see at the very high end of the income scale. Yes, so we understand, however, that's quite a departure from the system we have now. So we're committed to being pragmatic on the floor of Parliament. So if there are reforms that are possible to be made between what we have now and the universal basic income, then we would be in favour of those in Parliament. Not holding out for perfect being the enemy of the good, but making those changes as soon as we can.
Okay, let's go to Paul, and we'll go from Paul soon quickly on to Tim, and then we'll start with. We've already got our first hand up, so Michael's eager to ask you a question, and we'll get back to that shortly. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Austin. We all know that there are a lot of problems that are facing us, and we categorise those into four. We think that there are social problems, which are include things such as mental illness, etc. There's the economy, but we also see the economy as a subset of the socio, because it's by citizens and for citizens. So we think at the moment there's a lot of resources going into the idea of what we term jobs politics. And we think that the universal survival income has a role to play there as well, which we'll get to. The other 2 points that are confronting us are, of course, the environment, and which can be broken into two. And that is, firstly, the international. So we have problems with, a lot of it's communist remnants, actually, which we'll also come to in a moment as well. Putin and Xi, especially, also Kim, of course. And the final part, the other component of the environment is the natural environment, of course. So we have the socio, the econo, we have the international enviro, and we have the natural enviro, all of which are causing us problems. So we have all these problems, but we think they're all a symptom of one thing. And we think it goes back about 260 years to the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to put in a spoiler here and tell you what it is. We think it's survival income slavery. So what happened in the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution, before that, most people were subsistence farmers, of course. And so basically they were providing their own needs, and they were in little communities. With the Industrial Revolution, we said, all right, this is we're all in this together, really. That's what it was. It's a watershed of we're all in this together. And people gave up their providing for themselves, providing their own basic needs, and they went and worked in factories and such. But there were massive benefits, economies of scale benefits, with the use of specialisation, but also machines. But it made the people very vulnerable because, if they didn't have a job, if they didn't have paid work, then they no longer had their subsistence land and their subsistence skills, and so they would starve. But an interesting thing happened in the last 260 years, if you look back on it. And we've gained 5 or 4 cornerstones. We should have gained 5. The first one was universal liberal democracy. That started banging around, and it sort of evolved. We haven't had a narrative for any of this, but it's just happened anyway. And so it's been painful, because there was no narrative, no plan that we followed. So as I said, we had universal liberal democracy and the universal rule of law. Okay, before that, people were just doing their own thing in their little communities and that, but now we have national laws and the real infiltration of that into communities. And then, of course, we evolved universal education, and in Australia we've evolved universal healthcare. And the one we haven't evolved is the universal survival income, and arguably that should have been the first. And so what happened instead was, and I'll just say this also, that there should be a lot of congratulations flowing around, but it's not really understood. There should be a lot of congratulations for the left, because they're the ones who initiated all of the 4 cornerstones that we have. But there should be also a lot of congratulations for the right, because although they were late, they did come on board. They did give bipartisan support to it, and they did improve it. And I'll just say this, that we think the left, if you boil it down, basically the guardians of cooperation, and we think the right are the guardians of competition, and we need both. Getting back to the survival income slavery, what's happened instead, whereas the other 4 cornerstones, if you look at them, they're all universal, they're all guaranteed, and they're all unconditional. And this is what the left did. They made sure of it. They made sure they were all universal, guaranteed, and unconditional. And yet, because there was no narrative, somehow they went off track on the 5th one. On the universal survival income, instead of putting that in, what happened is it evolved in a perverse fashion. It evolved in an unnatural fashion. And we ended up with universal minimum hourly wages, which have nothing to do with poverty, which wouldn't have evolved if we'd had the universal survival income. Worse than that, they evolved communism. And communism is the eradication of competition. So we need both cooperation and competition. And communism was a way of addressing survival income slavery, but doing so by eradicating competition, which didn't work, and we're still suffering for it.
Okay, Paul,
is that enough time, Austin?
We can come back to some of these, to some of the big picture issues. I love to go big picture, but I wanted to get everyone a chance, before we get too deep, to sort of briefly round up their basic income policies. I'm going to go to Tim now. Tim, why don't you tell us about the Greens and the guaranteed minimum income policy that they've proposed?
Thanks very much, Austin, and thanks for organising this event. Great to be here tonight. Just want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and those still to come. Noting, of course, that in Indigenous culture, the idea of work, of labour, as we think of it now, didn't exist, doesn't exist in Indigenous cultures. The idea of labour on behalf of somebody else and being paid for it is quite a modern idea. And I guess if we had time, I'd be interested in kind of challenging Paul's narrative of history, because I think it's the inverse in some ways. In that the Industrial Revolution was how we stopped being all in it together and started being forced into labour, which we didn't choose and didn't want. And to me, I think what's at the core of the UBI conversation is that one of the key ways, the most fundamental ways in which the state and capital work together to enforce labour is through making unemployment absolutely abysmal, making not being part of the paid workforce absolutely unacceptable unless you happen to have a huge amount of inherited wealth. So keeping unemployment payments very, very low, keeping them conditional, forcing people to jump through endless flaming hoops in order to get scraps from the table. That is how this system is enforced. And the Greens as a party have always wanted to unpick that. The idea of some kind of guaranteed minimum income has been part of Greens platforms around the world since the formation of the Greens parties in the early 1980s. And in various places, we have been pushing towards the adoption of an explicit UBI type policy. And I'm really delighted that after many years of work with the Green Institute, kind of bringing UBI into the conversation in Australian politics and in Australian Greens politics, this election, the Greens have actually adopted a policy that is really, several steps down the road towards the UBI. The only part of the UBI that is not in our policy at this point is the universal aspect of it, but it is the other U, unconditional. So what we're proposing this election is what we're calling a livable income guarantee, which kind of emerged out of conversations that the Institute hosted early on in the pandemic, which led to all sorts of conversations kind of spinning out of what the government did actually do, which was suspending mutual obligations and increasing the rate of job seeker at the time. And Elise Klein and others have done analysis of quite how much an extraordinary impact on people's lives it had to do that. So what we're calling for is to make that permanent. Our policy this election is to immediately lift all income support payments, all of them. So, job seeker, youth allowance, Oz Study, Ab Study, the age pension, disability support pension, all of them, to above the Henderson poverty line. That's $88 a day, and to index it to the poverty line to make sure that people stay supported above the poverty line. So lifting the rate is the crucial first part of it. And the second is to abolish all conditionality. And we mean all conditionality. So the requirement to spend down your savings before you're eligible, the requirement to, the parental income test if you're living out of home, all of the work for the dole, the parents next, all of those extraordinarily punitive surveillance-based policies, which do, let's be clear, do nothing to help anyone. Nothing to help anyone. All of these mutual obligations, so-called, as John Howard kind of really built his politics on in many ways, are about punishing the poor, punishing people for being unemployed, as a warning to others not to leave the workforce, not to walk away from unpleasant labour. They make it harder to get back on your feet. They make it harder to live your life. They make it harder to find new employment. So we want to abolish all of those. The third part of the policy, which I think is also a crucially important one, is to end the privatisation of the job services network. So all of the Commonwealth job service providers that had been privatised and outsourced to private companies, to bring them back under Commonwealth control so that the government can actually say, no, these are about actually helping people find paid labour if that's what they choose to do, not about giving these extraordinarily nasty private corporations the capacity to earn money from people's immiseration. That's probably enough of an introduction, and look forward to the conversation.
Great to hear from all of you. Michael has his hand up, so we're going to have Michael and Simon have got their hands up. We're going to do their questions. Then I, as host, I can't actually put my hand up, but I've put a little bookmark in after Simon speaks. I want to get back to Paul and Tim and the Industrial Revolution and free will and all of that great stuff. But Michael, go ahead. You put your hand up during Andrea's question, so I'm going to guess that she's got first response to this.
Yes. I'm just wondering, in the way you are talking, are you intending for your UBI to replace welfare? In other words, there would be no more welfare as it's currently offered. So just wondering how you're intending to integrate between the UBI and the welfare.
Yeah, so we imagine it replaces unemployment payments, but also a lot of others. We've got a very complicated system at the moment, but we do imagine other increased or top-up payments, for example, disability payments. So, yeah, there's a lot of of payments that happen right now in the Centrelink system. And yeah, I probably wouldn't be able to go through right now what our plan would be to match or to migrate all of those. But yeah, we do see a role for other welfare.
Quickly, have you considered just treating the UBI as income for welfare entitlement so that you don't change the system? You just say, well, once your income gets above the cutoff point, well, you lose it. But if it never gets above the cutoff point, then you still retain whatever residual benefits that you would get. So whether you've looked at that, I don't know, but it's something that we've been in Basic Income Australia certainly keen to get discussed.
Yeah, we've looked at we've looked at a few different models, and yeah, we would be happy to explore more. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks, Austin.
Simon.
Andrea.
No worries. Simon. You have to unmute your microphone, and camera on would also be great if you can.
Hey, hello everyone. Give me a second. Okay. Hi everyone. I have can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So I have a couple of questions, and this originates from my discussion with my sister about the topic of UBI just yesterday. And first question, which I wasn't able to. First question that I want to ask is, for each of the candidates who are here tonight, with your UBI policies, does that cover non-citizens?
Let's go to all three in quick succession, I think, with that one. We'll do Tim and then Paul and then Andrea.
Short answer, yes. Permanent residents, also refugees, for instance, on transfer visas and all sorts of things. Not, temporary visitors, of course, but if you have some form of residency, yes.
Definitely not. I mean, this is society is for its citizens. However, everybody else will also be looked after, but it'll be a different policy.
Yes, we hadn't imagined the UBI extending to non-citizens, but similarly to Paul, we would want to make sure everyone is financially supported if they don't have their own income.
Okay, great. And second question is, with UBI, with everyone having more money, what sort of effect could we expect to have on inflation? Because everyone's got more money, and everyone knows that everyone else has got more money, could prices go up somewhat? And if so, any idea of how much?
Let's do the same order with our panelists.
Barely any, because what we're talking about is poverty line support. So essentially, what we're saying with our UBI is at the Henderson poverty line. So what you need in order to survive. So we're talking about people who currently can't actually afford to put proper meals on the table, to keep a roof over their heads, to go to the doctor and fill prescriptions that they need, that kind of thing. So it's about meeting poverty level ability to survive. Giving those people that capacity to survive will not have an impact on inflation. And I believe that's the case for pretty much any model of UBI, because what you're going to see with any model of UBI is giving poor people the capacity to survive and taxing rich people more, because that's the flip side of this conversation that hasn't actually been mentioned yet today. Whether or not we want to get into a conversation about MMT, and whether it's actually funding the project or whether it's taking money out to counter the inflation kind of doesn't really matter. The point is, we'll actually be reducing the excessive spending capacity of the wealthy and enabling poor people to actually be able to survive.
Paul?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting question, I think. I mean, if you listen to the Reserve Bank governor, it's only 2 or 3 months ago that he was saying, oh, we're going to make a real push on unemployment now. And of course, there's a relationship between inflation and unemployment. And I don't know what he thought was going to happen. But the more he pushed on unemployment, the inflation goes up. And then, of course, you've got the pressure for wage rises. So, and anyway, getting back to our policy, we call it the USI reform, the Universal Survival Income Reform. The reason for that is that while you have the Universal Survival Income, you trade up from minimum wages. So there'd be no minimum wages. What that means, if you've got no minimum wages, there's no unemployment. And so you don't have to do what the RBA governor did and try to get unemployment down, because it's already zero. It's perpetually zero.
Let's go to Andrea.
Yeah, I suppose similarly to what Tim said, we wouldn't expect inflation from the purchasing power because, as you mentioned, these are people who are choosing between food and rent and medicines. So we'd expect any change coming from the increased demand for those essentials would be minimal. You might see some changes to the demand in super yachts if we're looking at so yeah, that the other part of the question that was brought in as well was the what we do at the upper end of the income scale. So we're aware of we're engaging with the question of the questions that modern monetary theorists are putting forward, and we understand that we don't need to raise taxes in the technical sense to pay for the a basic income, but in the first instance, we'd be looking to make sure that we're not introducing any risks of inflation by introducing more money into the economy with this policy. So we would be looking to recoup from taxes, not necessarily income taxes. There are a lot of tax breaks that are really only available to wealthier people.
Just to clarify, what I meant was more in the cost of living, where you might have more of just everyday essentials costing just that little bit more because there's more money to go around, I guess, and companies like to raise their prices when they think they can get more.
Yeah, I suppose we'd expect it to be minimal because it's the small number of people who are struggling to choose between those various essentials, and they will be a lot better off.
When I was having this discussion with my sister, I was actually showing her the Fusion UBI policy, and what my thinking was is that maybe the prices may go a little bit up, but at the end of the day, everyone's got an extra amount of money. For example, $500 that Fusion has put on, and that would also negate some of the price rise. So that's some people, they might see that number and think, oh, that's quite a high amount, but I think that could also already factor in that there might be a little bit of price rise in that, and it's not really a price rise because you've got the extra money to actually pay for that, whatever the prices may be, and obviously that's an adjustable figure as well, depending on how things go.
Can I just quickly jump in and recommend to everybody that if they're interested in these issues of UBI and inflation, that they check out our episodes with Eddie Chu and our last one with Alex Howlett, that's just from 2 weeks ago, where one's basic income and inflation and one's basic income and the economic meltdown, right? So we try and situate the basic income exactly in all of these issues. And I think that the approach that is just sort of outlined in those two presentations is really quite compatible with pretty much parts of it are compatible with everything, with what all of our panelists are saying today. So I'm just going to get a quick plug in there. And so, Simon, do you want to wrap up with any final thoughts or get?
I can see Josh's ears perking up through this conversation. I'm wondering if he has anything to add.
Josh. Josh is where we're going next.
No, he doesn't. Okay. Third and final question is, with it, and it circles back to the previous two with possible cost of living rises and also not applying to non-citizens for two out of the three. So my sister, she works in aged care, and the majority of the workers in her aged care are non-citizens who are, permanent residents, maybe study visa with a side of work, or work with a side of study, whatever it may be. But they're in aged care. They're the ones doing a hard work, literally wiping our grandparents' bottoms, because doing the jobs that most Australians don't want to do. And if there was some sort of price rises and more cost of living pressures on them, and there's and everyone else is getting UBI but not them, that could be overly difficult for those people. So I'm just wondering if there's been any consideration for that sort of thing, or like a good answer that I could tell her about that.
Let's get quick answers from everyone. Tim, Paul, Andrea.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah. So we'd imagined the universal aspect would apply to citizens, because we've to date we've envisioned it as a sort of citizens dividend sharing in the wealth of the nation. But you make a good point about a lot of non-citizens who are working here, resident in Australia. So just, I suppose, as I said, we would make sure that anyone who is lacking the income needed was supported as well.
Tim?
If you're here in Australia for an extended period of time, if you're working, if you're paying taxes, you should get the benefits that other people get. The Greens want to make the path to citizenship easier, of course, anyway. But to me, if you think back about in terms of what happened during the pandemic in 2020, when JobSeeker was doubled and mutual obligations suspended, and for instance, people on temporary protection visas or overseas students who were here in Australia and couldn't get home were basically left to starve. And they survived purely where they did on through the generosity of neighbours, because Australia's government just basically said, stuff you, we don't care, you're not citizens, we're not going to look after you. The Greens aren't in the business of actually subscribing to that kind of policy. If you're here, if you're living here, you should get the benefit of this.
Paul?
First of all, I just got to say, I agree with Tim. It was terrible the way we treated these people who were guests in our country. With this issue, I think there'll be a lot of washout, and the main thing is to get our systems right, and then we see, and things will take care of themselves a little bit after that. For example, with foreigners, well, maybe some of them won't be here. They've chosen to come here for whatever reason, and maybe they won't. Now, I'm not saying I want that to happen. Maybe there'll be more, but I think it'll sort itself out. But the other thing is, the major point is that when you abolish survival income slavery, that means a lot of the people working in these jobs who are Australian will no longer be so keen to do that. And what that means is that the wage will go up. So that will actually benefit everybody, whether they're citizens or non-citizens working in aged care. So, there's a lot of talk at the moment. Of course, it's quite a topic about, we've got to increase the payment for aged care and for teachers and all that, and various other jobs. I agree with that, but I think it's completely the wrong way to do it artificially. If you do it by eliminating,
I'm going to jump in there. So this actually, to me, ties in back to the Industrial Revolution and free will and everything that we raised at the beginning. So this is a bookmark. It's the perfect time.
I'll mute myself.
Because what you're saying that I actually think Tim agrees with, and I would be surprised if most people on this by introducing a basic income and increasing the economic security of people across the board, you also get more power as a worker. It gives workers greater leverage because they're less desperate. And this ties back into what we were talking about before with the Industrial Revolution. And I don't think your positions are that far apart. So during just to frame one way that I've heard it framed, which I quite like, is to use the English law as the sort of simplified history of the Industrial Revolution. And one of them, and so everyone's heard of the Magna Carta, right? Which is the thing that gave the rights to the lords to have, fancy courts or whatever, and they're sort of the beginning of liberal rights. But there was another document as well called the Charter of the Forest, and what that guaranteed was sort of communal access to land, to gather firewood, to hunt, to draw your subsistence directly from the land, and that was actually enshrined in law. And then we saw that eroded at the beginning of the or attacked quite viciously during the Industrial Revolution, sort of forcing people into slums where they became, the industrial workforce that will send their kids in to work 12 hours a day, that will keep working at the factory after it's chewed up their leg, and sort of take the raw deal. Now I'll go to Tim
Can I
first.
just quickly ask Paul a question from what he was? Can I respond to Paul's answer before we move on, just real quick?
Okay, sure.
So Paul, with what you were saying, how it would be a wage rise because there'll be less people of the Australian bunch who would want to be in that work. From what I was told from my sister is that already it's about 90% of all the nurses, carers, kitchen hands, and cleaners are non-citizen, and the other 10% are ones who do it because they genuinely enjoy that kind of work. So I'm not sure if I agree that that other 10% would move jobs, because I don't think they're in it because of financial pressure to begin with. It's not a very well-paid job to start with, and second of all, it's only 10%, so it wouldn't make that much difference. And I sort of get the fear that it would be forcing even more or pressuring even more of the non-citizens to be, become more desperate because they're being left behind if everyone else has got more money than them.
Especially if inflation's kicked in, as you were talking about before as well.
Exactly.
Right. So the cost of living's going up because all the citizens are so well off, but you've got these other people who are outside of that system, which is a bit like what happens in the Gulf, right? Where there's oil money for wealthy citizens of the Gulf countries, and then they have an underclass of people doing all the unpleasant jobs who don't have access to that largesse. So
I've seen some documentaries of what's going on in some of these countries, and they're building all this infrastructure and they're falling off bridges, and they just pick up a body and continue. It's absolutely horrendous what's going on over there.
Paul, do you want to respond very quickly to that? Oh, no, Tim, you go ahead, and I think you can quite easily loop that back into what we were discussing before as well.
Yeah, to loop back into that conversation, and I suspect that Paul and I aren't necessarily that far apart. It's probably a matter of framing. I guess the way I understood what you said, Paul, was the suggestion that kind of the Industrial Revolution was, in a sense, a voluntary process where people were kind of choosing to go in a particular direction. And my understanding of that history, from my reading of that history, is completely the opposite, is that it was a massively coercive process that saw people driven off the land, off the commons, as Austin has pointed out, where they were able to actually feed themselves through commons processes into slums, into factories. And it's kind of one of the most coercive processes in world history, alongside colonialism and imperialism, that we have seen, which kind of leads us to the continuing coercive role of wage labor, wage slavery, however, as you're kind of suggesting in that sense in the modern day. So it's probably a difference in framing and understanding of that history, but I suspect our our views are very much similar.
Paul, did you want to
Yeah,
respond
I
quickly
think,
to that? Oh, sorry.
yeah, I think, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think both happened. Another thing is that, of course, it happened over, the process started, in 1760, around then. So if you imagine, if you just take a certain individual or a certain family, 10 years later or 20 years later, let alone 100 years later, they've lost their capacity to be a subsistence farmer. They've lost their land. So it may have been that they did choose, and some did choose. Many did choose to go into the factory because they could earn a little bit more. You know, it mightn't look much to us, but it might have been 20% more than what they were getting, which was not much. But of course, there was direct slavery as well. So I think there was both. But once you've lost your skills of subsistence farming skills, your community and your land, well, you've got no choice, have you? And then really became tough for a lot of people, I think. But look, there was just one other point quickly that you mentioned about the Aboriginal societies, and look, I agree with you. But one difference is, and this is what the Industrial Revolution did. It created a society of strangers. So whereas in all of our traditional societies, whether Aboriginal or whatever everyone else was, the society initially, the tribe, everybody knew each other. But of course, with the machines and moving to cities and the Industrial Revolution, we had a society of strangers. So I think that's a massive difference.
If I could just jump in here, it sounds like, yeah, there's certain similarities here in what Tim and Paul are both saying here. And I wonder about the role of information, of people moving to cities with the Industrial Revolution. I don't doubt that there was coercion, but at the same time, some people presumably chose that for themselves, and then it wasn't what they might have been led to believe, and the promises didn't come through of the promises didn't come true of leading a happy and productive life. And I'm just wondering about parallels to today, where industries are changing faster and faster than ever before, where we've got to move to a decarbonised economy. And I think that's a very important place for to bring in a universal basic income, or a way to ensure that everyone has their needs looked after as we go through this huge disruption, which has to happen.
Let's go to Josh.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks everyone. I think we can assume from trying to make sense of the answers, I think it somehow got sidetracked to the Industrial Revolution, and sort of reminds me of if you I don't know if you participate, but there's a thing called political compass memes on Reddit, and the saying is "return to monkey." That's the Industrial Revolution was a mistake. That's what it reminds me of. So it is quite entertaining, but I guess the focus of tonight is policy. That it's good to have that discussion another time. I'm definitely interested. But I think
a very policy related question.
And I think what I can basically get from that is that basically with people getting left behind in jobs where this might not scale to, there might be some other thing put in place, like maybe raising the minimum wage of aged care to make sure that these people are looked after where it doesn't fit. That's all I can assume would be the case. So I'm happy to leave it at that. Thanks for your time. We can move on to the next thing.
Thanks, Simon. Josh.
I'd like to say thank you for the candidates for coming along today. My question is, what do you see as the most viable path to implementing your preferred policy? How do we get from here to there?
Did you want to go alphabetical again, Austin? You're on mute, but I'll take that as a yes.
Sorry, yes, you go first, please.
Yeah, look, I'd have to say for Fusion, the first step would be getting members elected. So please vote for us if you like our policies. So if we get there in one step or we get there in 10 steps, I suppose, as I said, it's a short answer from me. We'll be pragmatic in pursuing more universality of above the poverty line income for everyone. So short answer, I think.
Paul.
Yeah, it's a good. This is the guts of it, isn't it? I mean, how are we going to get there? So, what I think is that we must do it in a bipartisan fashion. I mean, if you compare it to raise the rate and other campaigns, they've been, they haven't been bipartisan. They haven't worked, and I think the way to do it is to not forget about the right and do the opposite. Remember the right and give them something. And as it turns out, I think the best policy does give them something, and that is to trade in the minimum wages, which we don't need, and trade them in. Not only do we not need them, they're counterproductive because they produce unemployment. And so people have to have an opportunity, and so they need their survival needs taken care of. That they cannot be subject to survival income slavery, but they also need to be able to do what they like, and that including get a job, which means zero unemployment. So that's the way to do it. Labour market deregulation.
Tim.
Couple of different answers to this running in parallel. Really good question. Thanks, Josh. One is that I think we can make incremental progress in terms of removing conditionality. Labor's already, thanks to the really growing push from the grassroots, committed to abolishing the cashless welfare card, for instance. That's one of the nastiest of all of the conditionalities that's been introduced. And Labor has finally been pushed into a position where they've agreed that they will abolish that. I think we can start there, and we can, raise more and more and more of these conditionalities that have been introduced, and piece by piece start to peel them away. The second part of that picture relates to one of the things that I mentioned in that first part of the picture, which is Labor has been pushed there. Labor has been dragged there by the power of campaigning. We need to build power. We need to build grassroots campaigns that will actually drag our politics kicking and screaming into that perspective. We need to convince trade unions, for instance, that this is an important piece of work to do. We need to convince the various social services groups that this is an important thing to do. And it's starting. It's starting. There are a couple of unions that are on board. Anglicare Australia has come on board. It's that kind of process that I think is crucial. Building power so that piece by piece we can pull the nasty conditional welfare system apart and build an unconditional one.
And what about in terms of the fact that what you're going for is not a universal basic income, that it's this sort of minimum guaranteed livable income, which, by the way, is pretty much what Martin Luther King actually advocated. A lot of UBI advocates like to say that Martin Luther King advocated a basic income, but what he actually said sounds a lot more like a minimum income guarantee. Is that seen within the Greens as a stepping stone to a truly universal payment, or is this seen by others in the Greens as the end goal, and that we shouldn't be supporting people who we shouldn't be, what's the response we've heard from I forget who it was in Labor, is like, oh, well, we're not going to give money to Gina Reinhart. Is there an element of that thinking within the Greens?
Yeah, of course, there's an element of that thinking in the Greens. It's a work in progress. I think there's definitely some who think that this is the end goal, and there's plenty of others like me who think it's the first step. But I do think it is a first step anyway. I think the crucial piece of the progress towards a universal payment is removing conditionality from existing payments in the first place. I think we really have to do that first for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I think it's a really important stepping stone on the way, but secondly, because we just have to do it. We're not going to get a UBI straight away. We have to do this for the sake of about 3 million people's lives in this country. We've just got to get it done. But it is a stepping stone too. Once we remove that conditionality, then we can shift the conversation in terms of deserving and undeserving and all of that bullshit and move on, and then start to talk about, okay, what does universality actually mean, and how we're going to get there. But at the same time, there's also other stepping stones that Ben Spies-Butcher and folks have talked about in terms of, making the age pension universal, for instance, or making a universal youth payment available, and those kinds of steps that we can do along the way.
There's an extreme version of that some American UBI activists came up with, where you have a payment that starts at 18 and 80 and moves down a year every year until it meets in the middle. But it would really suck if you happen to be just the right age to be like the last year to get it. You'd have to feel a little bit. I actually think this, Michael, I know you've got your hand up and we will come to you, but I think this is a great time to go to Andrea with a question that I'd like to ask, which is, what is so different about the Fusion Party and your policy platform that you guys aren't just members of the Greens?
We get that question a lot. Well, I think let's work back from the conclusion that we are different, because we've had members join our party, not only Fusion, but join the constituent parties that joined together to become Fusion. They joined the member parties, but they didn't join the Greens. So I think there is a lot of policy platform overlap, but it's probably the angle at which we're coming from. It's the vibe of the thing. It's the emphasis that we put on certain areas of policy. So the Pirate Party was coming from the civil liberties angle and digital rights, and that's something that they've carried on, and that's carried on into Fusion very strongly. The Science Party was always pushing for the regulations around new technology that would allow new technology to be used and for the benefit of citizens, rather than either banning it or letting it flourish to run away unregulated. So letting new technology, flourish for the benefit of citizens, whether that be nuclear fusion power, which is coming into its own in experiments overseas, and we'd love to see Australian scientists be able to do nuclear fusion experiments and continue the work in nuclear medicine that is done at the Lucas Heights reactor. So I think those are some of the more policy-based differences. Tim may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand there's a lot of consensus-based policy development in the Greens, whereas Fusion, coming together from our specialisations as we have, we tend to have that that stronger policy development in a more streamed kind of way. So we've got that's the way our policy development works. So a few internal differences and a few differences in the areas of policy. But
do you want to go over just quickly? Do you want to go over the differences in terms of your basic income policy, as what and how that's, because that's one area where there does seem to be a significant difference, because you guys are just all the way out there, right? Like it's outside the tax, it's outside the taxation system. It's universal. It does go to Gina Reinhart. It's the true universal basic income. Is that because there are people in Fusion who are actually making a case more like what Paul is saying, that we have a universal basic income, and then we liberalize the labor market, or we do some, now we fix the economy with the basic income so we can get rid of this other infrastructure? Is there an element of that?
That's part of it. And we also talk about, this is controversial and we get a lot of questions about it, a flat tax. People say you can't get rid of the flat tax, and Australians are very proud of our progressive taxation system that taxes higher incomes at a greater rate. But with the introduction of a universal basic income, it will not only increase the income of people at the lowest income end of the spectrum, and cut out the poverty traps that we get today, with people getting income support and then getting a little bit of work. And as you mentioned, up to 75% of that is lost in income support. But there are lots of tax loopholes that can only be used by the wealthiest people. So closing some of those is going to offset the difference in income tax if we look at a flat taxation rate. For instance, anyone earning over a certain amount, if they have children, they're likely to be getting their income paid into a trust fund where they pay the company tax rate instead of the personal income tax rate. There's other tax breaks that you get for being rich. You can invest in property where the capital gains tax discount is going to reduce the income that you get from selling houses relative to the income that you get from being paid for work. So I guess coming back to the question as to why we've proposed this policy, I think it's just that we're idealists, and we're just not scared to put that on the table, but we're also very willing to work towards it incrementally.
So earlier on, we were talking about taxes and MMT and funding and all of that. Sorry, Michael. I know that I'm abusing my privilege as host, but you'll just have to live with it for a second longer. The question what I almost brought up then was there's been a Twitter fight between Jeff Bezos and Joe Biden, or Joe Biden's staff who run the Twitter account, where Jeff Bezos was saying that taxes and inflation shouldn't be talked about at the same time. And I think the internet mostly ended up agreeing with Joe Biden and attacking Jeff Bezos, saying that obviously inflation is related to tax. But it seems to me you're agreeing on one hand because we want to close these tax loopholes for the wealthy. But then if you don't have a progressive tax system, you don't have this other lever to pull to balance the inflationary pressures of a basic income. So is having a flat tax, and is that going to actually undermine your capacity to deliver a basic income, because you won't be able to, or one that meets the poverty line, because you won't be able to constrain the spending power of people on higher incomes, which could erode the value of that basic income?
Yeah, well, I suppose if we look at the hypothetical, say we have an extremely low, I'm not suggesting that this is the income tax rate we'll be looking at, but if you look at an income tax rate of even higher than anyone has in Australia today, 50%, say, we're not suggesting that, all right, so that's a hypothetical. Someone getting paid $52,000 at the moment pays tax in Australia. Someone getting paid $52,000 with a 50% tax rate will have, under the system we propose, $26,000 of UBI a year, keeps $26,000 worth of their pay, and ends up effectively with the same income that they were paid. So I think there is room to move the taxation rate and still have people coming out better than they were before, even at very high tax rates. One other thing that we're looking at is, or that we support as a policy, is land tax. So replacing stamp duty with a broad-based land tax. So there's quite a few changes that we'd like to see. Land tax has been put forward as a very efficient tax by a lot of economists.
Obviously have an effect on housing affordability as well.
It's something, as a federally based party, it's something we'd need to.
I might give Tim a chance to respond. To that, and then Paul after him, because we've had a lot of great stuff on the Fusion Party's position. So let's just hear what they think about that, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, it stands to, it kind of backs up my understanding of the difference philosophically, I think, between the parties, and it's certainly I don't know all of the parties that came into Fusion, but I certainly do know a fair amount, and I've spoken to members of the Pirate Party and the Science Party. And my understanding of both of those parties is that they're much more libertarian philosophy than the Greens ever has been. The Greens are a much more collectivist, anarchist kind of approach to politics based on a consensus approach, grassroots democracy. We believe in in consensus decision making in our own processes and in broader political processes, and bringing people along with us. We don't believe in, we believe in listening to experts, and that experts should be respected and bring their views into the conversation. And then, you have the conversation around that rather than imposing from above. I think broadly, and the techno-optimist kind of approach as well is a less ecological approach. I think an ecological approach is much more about kind of understanding how we live together, not just with each other, but with the natural world, rather than finding techno solutions necessarily to everything. So there's a philosophical difference. There's quite a substantial philosophical difference, I think, between the Greens and Fusion. And that's probably, I think UBI is one of the places where our policies are probably closest than others in some ways. Yeah.
Paul, we were talking, you wanted to talk about the narrative and the big picture. I noticed earlier. I think this is probably your cue for that.
I don't really understand the issue about inflation. Inflation is controlled through monetary policy predominantly. So, this is just another expenditure like the rest of them. And as I said, if you don't have to worry about unemployment, you don't sort of trying to achieve two targets with one policy. If you're trying to achieve the two targets of inflation and unemployment with monetary policy, you're going to have a problem because you can only achieve one of them. With regards to tax, and this is where I contradict myself a little bit. We think that there should be an increase in the GST. So there would be a one-off increase in inflation, but a one-off increase is no problem. You might remember back, if you're old enough, to when they put in the GST and everyone was so worried about inflation. Of course, prices went up 10%. But a one-off is no problem. It's the trend that's the issue. So if you think of so our inflation has actually been extremely low since we've had the GST. So if it's 5.1% now, then given that the GST of 10% is on about 60%, it means that that component that's due to the GST is about 0.6 or something like that. So so I don't see any problem with the tax or the inflation, and in actual fact, the economy will become efficient, and that's something that we have no idea what that looks like, because going back to the Industrial Revolution again, our productivity has increased about 10,000-fold, and yet we're only 216 times as wealthy as Burundi, which is the poorest country in the world and is poorer than 1760 Britain. So we're doing something really wrong. And if you think about things like all the crime, the law enforcement, the mental health. The Productivity Commission says it's costing us 200 billion per year. 200 billion. That's half of what the USI is going to cost right up there. So if we can iron all that out, we get a minimalist infrastructural government systems. We're not going to be worrying about inflation, unemployment, tax, or anything else.
Yeah, that's really interesting points from all three of you. There's stuff in what each of you said that I really like. Let's go to Michael. Thank you for waiting patiently, Michael.
That's okay. My question's to Tim this time. Tim, I just want to try and understand when you're talking about removing unconditionality. We'll just take an example. I've lost my job. I just go to the office and say, I've send a link, I've lost my job, and they just sign me up. I mean, how is that going to work if there are no conditions in terms of you getting your entitlement?
Exactly the same way as the tax system works, Michael. The tax system works on the same basis. You self-report, and it's managed, it's audited occasionally. You look at it, you make sure it works. If you go to, it's about removing conditionality, not removing, observation and making sure it's correct. So if you're fully employed and you go to Centrelink and say, I've lost my job, can I have some payments, please? Well, it's going to come to people's attention and you're going to get in trouble for it. So it's not saying that we, don't manage it and avoid that kind of thing. It's saying you won't be forced to attend a job seeker, a job service provider several times a week to apply for a dozen different jobs, which everybody knows you're not going to get, and be forced to go to parenting programs and report in on all of these bases and all of this kind of thing. It's a self-reporting thing, the same as the income tax system.
You lose your job. I've lost my job today. That night I go online. I say I've lost my job. 2 days later, the benefits start coming in.
Correct.
6 or 7 weeks later, I get a job and I just get online and say, well, I don't need the benefit anymore.
Yep. Exactly.
Can we push further? Can we push further and have a system where I don't even need to apply? So the tax office just says this person hasn't reported any income for a fortnight, so we better give him some.
Except not all people.
How you manage that when we've got kind of PAYE as well as PAYG and all of that kind of stuff.
I'm only thinking
set up some kind of algorithm for it. yeah, not sure.
It does sound kind of ideal, but that would take, I think, some building up of the digital infrastructure of government, given their record on digital projects so far, especially when it comes to privacy and handling of citizens' data.
Let's get some more questions. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so I just wanted to comment on the flat tax side that if you actually tax all expenditure, then a flat tax is directly proportional to an income tax. And so a 50% GST is equivalent to a 33% tax on income. So that, if we could get people to understand that is the exact equivalence, then we could replace all taxes with a flat tax on expenditure, all expenditure, and then pay everybody a UBI, and then the combination of the UBI and the flat tax is actually progressive because it ensures that the people at the bottom are getting a UBI and paying very little tax on expenditure, whereas the people at the top are paying a huge amount of tax at the flat rate because they're spending a huge amount of money and getting a relatively small UBI. So
I'm sorry, Michael. I'm going to have to challenge you there because this is what the Yang campaign did as well. When they said they're going to have a VAT, which is regressive, and then pair it with a UBI and then say together they're progressive. It's like, one of the policies is regressive and one of the policies is progressive, but why not? But why are we anyhow? Why do we want to get a progressive policy?
I also think it's worth pointing out that the wealthy spend a far smaller proportion of their wealth and their money on at all than the poor do. So that system is inherently regressive.
Well, except though that you would, Tim, if you applied it to all spending, right? So spending on assets as well as spending on goods and services, then if the wealthy aren't spending their money, then they're not consuming anything at all. But if they, as soon as they,
which is how they're accumulating so much wealth. That's which is how they're accumulating so much wealth. That's Piketty's analysis and many others. They're accumulating wealth because they're not spending it, whereas the poor spend almost all of their income. That's why they're remaining poor. The wealthy are accumulating more and more because they don't have to spend very much comparatively.
most of it is, they spend a lot, they spend on assets. But anyway, we won't talk about that now.
Well, we'd have to, well, let's go to Josh. And after that, I would really like for maybe Jess or Emma or someone who's not me or Michael to ask a question. So Josh, you go ahead.
I have a slightly horse racy question. I'm just wondering, as you're out on the campaign trail and you're talking about your policy, what do you think? Well, what are people saying that they think of it? Positive, negative? What are you hearing mostly?
Well, we're not actually getting as much time to go into depth with people as we like on the policy. It sounds good to people. Cost of living is front of people's minds. I think when we talk in this country about the economy being the major election issue, we're actually unfortunately not talking about the bigger picture economy. What is Australia producing? What are we doing with the resources of this country? We're talking about the hip pocket. We're talking about whether we can afford our expenses this week or not. So yeah, I'm not sure how much depth we're managing to get into with many voters, but it's popular because it'll relieve cost of living pressures for a lot of people.
All right. So Emma, you've got your hand up. Great.
Can I answer Josh's question?
Sorry, Tim. I didn't mean to cut you off. Tim and Paul, sorry. Then we'll go to Emma.
I've been finding for a long time that people are just so interested in UBI when you bring it up. The media isn't, the mainstream political discourse is not, just doesn't understand it at all. But when I've been out and about in public meetings and things like that, it gets raised and people love it. I've also done, that's on UBI specifically. On the livable income guarantee, in particular, we've been doing door knocks in student housing and in public housing, where we've been talking about the livable income guarantee and getting mental and dental health covered by Medicare. And it's getting a really, really good reception, People are fascinated by it. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry, if I can just shoehorn one thing in here. Giving people that income that they need to cover their basic needs includes things like getting themselves to the doctor or the dentist, and Fusion also wants to have mental and dental health under Medicare. And then that actually amounts to a saving in the federal budget. So it's, again, the Australian government can spend as much as it wants, but there are cost savings involved as well with making sure everyone has the income they need for the basics.
Paul.
The biggest problem with this policy is that it's too good. I get to no poverty and no unemployment, and a lot of people just say, you're dreaming. But actually, it's far better than even that, because it's like a universal education on steroids. I mean, you can say, well, how much does universal education cost? And no one cares, because we know that the benefits are manifold. So, we know what happens if you don't have universal education. You're a very poor country. This is the same. So, you start off saying, as I said, no poverty, no unemployment, and then you go, well, no harassment with the mutual obligations, no dole bludgeon narrative, no, welfare to work problem, the poverty trap issue and all that. And then you can sort of go off into how strong the economy is going to be. And that is a phenomena all on its own. I mean, we would have unrivaled productivity. Our regions would boom. I mean, all the manufacturing that, they want to throw subsidies to promote manufacturing. You don't need to. All you need to do is implement this policy, trade up from the minimum wages, and just unleash it. It'll be, as I say, a phenomenon.
are you not imagining the UBI as a kind of wage subsidy then? If you're allowing if you're undermining the minimum wage system, are you also taking away the award wage system? Are you getting rid of the Fair Work Commission and all of that, what you would see as regulatory junk, and bringing the basic income in as a replacement for all of that, and a subsidy to allow employers to lower their wages so we can be more competitive in the global market? Is that a fair assessment?
Just to clarification on the last one, the subsidy. Why a subsidy? I don't.
Well, people say it's a wage. So you're saying we don't need to subsidize manufacturing, but if you're saying that we can by paying this, we're allowing manufacturers to lower their wages, then what we are is subsidizing employment. We're subsidizing employers by allowing them to lower their wages. I mean, there's so much we could say that we could discuss on that front, but I'm just trying to get clear on what your position is.
Yeah. Okay. So there's one issue which doesn't come up, and that is that the idea of a volunteer army. So I don't know if any of you have military experience or whatever, but when you compare a conscript army to a volunteer army, it's ridiculous, right? The increase. And at the moment, we're all, or a very, very large percentage of people, even the ones working, under survival income slavery. In other words, they don't want to be there. You've got all the office politics, all that sort of stuff is a symptom of it. Now you know yourself, if you want to clean your room or something, you can probably do it in 5 minutes if you really want to do it. But if you don't want to do it, you can mess around for a couple of hours and still not have it done. And that's what our workplace is like. It's on steroids, like everything else. I use that a lot, I know. But so there's a lot of problems. Getting back to your issue about the Fair Work Commission and all that stuff has developed because we have worker exploitation. And the reason we have worker exploitation is because we have survival income slavery. If there's no unemployment, that means that people have got plenty of options for other jobs. And as we all know, they don't have to work anyway if they don't want to with the USI.
Great. Emma.
All right, my question's for Tim. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Yeah, okay,
Yes,
cool.
we can.
All right, so currently the job seeker payment is roughly $200 below the poverty line. By increasing the payments to $88 a day, the Henderson poverty line, you're edging much closer to current full-time minimum wage levels. So with the current job seeker, as you earn money, you lose roughly 60 cents to the dollar. So that in and of itself is a poverty trap, but because it's so low, it kind of forces everyone into work, which is what the Greens is trying to avoid. But how isn't this amplifying the poverty trap situation? Sort of.
I'm not sure I necessarily follow the logic of that part of the question.
I guess what incentivizes anyone to do a minimum wage job if you can get $88 a day? If you're, because you would lose an income, right, as you would earn money similar to what the current system is, or how does that interact?
Yes, but most people want to work. This is the thing that I think is often forgotten in this part of the conversation. Most people actually want to work. That's partly why the effective marginal tax rate conversation is kind of so stuck, because most people continue to make those choices that neoclassical economic theory says that they won't make, because they want to work. They want to be out there doing stuff. So yes, there would be a phase out of income support as you earn more money, but that's partly why we need to raise the minimum wage too, of course, is a key part of the issue. The Greens want to see income support payments at the Henderson poverty line, indexed to the Henderson poverty line to make sure nobody's living below that level. But we also want to raise the minimum wage substantially and index that to inflation and index it to the median wage, so that there's a bigger gap there, in fact, as well. So that might be part of the answer to the question, but also it's about how you manage those.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that answers the question. I want to just jump in with a second question because I saw it in the chat and I was just curious because there's been a couple of things brought up about pilots. I know that the Greens was previously running on a pilot in Nowra. Is that still on the cards or like not? I don't know. A UBI pilot project?
There was conversation about that. I think that was with the New South Wales. That was a proposal from the New South Wales Greens in the New South Wales Parliament, not a federal Greens one. I'm not sure where that's up to, I'm afraid.
We'll
have to get our previous.
That's true.
We'll have to get our previous guest, Abigail Boyd. Everyone can go back to episode 1 of Basic Income Australia and see her on our show. But we'll get her back on to ask about that. Jessica, you've got a question.
Hi, I have a couple, but I don't know if we'll have time for it this evening. So if I had to prioritize one question for each of the candidates, as you go campaigning, what is the key concern you hear from constituents about the basic income proposals you have? And then what is your key response to that concern that you see coming up and again in discussions?
In my experience, if I can jump in since I hadn't muted myself, the key response from most people is how the hell will you pay for it? So that brings us to to that MMT rich conversation again. But the key point that I always make is wealth taxation. So usually when I'm door knocking or anything, I'm not going to have a conversation about MMT with people. I'm not going to get into that depth. They basically want to know how are you going to pay for it? And we talk about a wealth tax on billionaires, making sure the corporations pay their fair share, that kind of thing, which is also an answer from an MMT perspective, just a different framing of it. But that's the number one. That's basically the only concern that people raise, in fact, in my experience.
Do we want
so I agree. That's my experience also. Same with Tim. How are you going to pay for it? For us, I think it's easy though. Easy response because labour market deregulation already gives you just as I say, we don't know what the productivity benefits are going to be, and of course that just means our society has this massive cake that's not been taken up with sort of addressing the messes that we're sort of manufacturing for ourselves, like mental illness. You'll have far less of it. And then we've got the GST as well. There's just incredible savings, as I said, and with the economy going gangbusters, and so that sort of sums that up. Andrea made a good point before, actually, about the possibility of a land tax. That's I don't think we even need income taxes, but that's another issue.
And no surprises. I was just going to say, no surprises. How are you going to pay for it? Also, a bit of concern about whether it's going to be inflationary, and it's kind of the same thing. Just start out with taxes to not spending money into existence, or however if people like to characterize it. So making sure it's balanced within the tax and redistribution system in the first instance, and also just there'll be savings. I'm certain there will be savings involved in the health system and what we like to call the justice system, from making sure everyone has the essentials of living.
Okay, I'm going to be, before we go to Michael for the last question, which will be an intelligent, interesting one, I'm going to give everyone, I'm going to be a bit of a mean journalist and make everyone answer yes or no. Is it necessary to balance the budget is a deficit an inherently bad thing? Is that a failure of government every time there's a deficit? Do we need to balance the budget? We'll go Andrea first, then Paul, then Tim.
If you want a
Yes or
one-word
no?
answer, then
Yes, one-word answer.
oh, come on. I mean, in the simplest terms, it has to be no, but there's caveats. Yeah, we don't want to build in a structural deficit.
Okay, Paul.
Yes, and we'll never have to worry about it with this policy. So it'll be a non-issue.
All right, Tim.
No, with caveats.
No, with caveats. All right, Michael. We're now running past time. Do our guests mind staying? Let me just quickly ask. Do our guests mind staying for an extra 5 minutes while we get this question and a sign off done? Is that all right? Tim, Paul. We're wrapping up 9:30. Okay. Okay, Michael. Let's get this question out in less than 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. It's just a clarification again, really, Tim. When you're looking at people applying for benefits, if somebody has to stop work because they've now got to care for young kids or elderly or disabled, people who are at home, are they still entitled to claim the benefit because they have chosen to give up work, or how would that work, do you see?
Yes. We currently have carers allowance, for instance. Yes, they should be entitled to it if that's what they're doing.
Okay.
There is a slight, okay. I don't necessarily need to go into it, but there is a slight difference with the John Quiggin et al. Model that we do still want to see the payments. The Greens' current model is that payments would be concomitant to existing payments. So carers allowance is one of those, for instance, but not simply choosing not to work currently in the Greens policy, although I would like to see it go there.
Right. So ultimately,
in principle, I would have to tell the government not only that I'm out of work, but that I'm looking for work before I could receive the payment. I would still have to make that statement of moral virtue.
Not that you're looking for work, but not that you're looking for paid labour in the workforce. So, for instance, DSP at the moment, disability support pension, you do not have to be looking for work. Aged pension, of course, you do not have to be looking for work.
So if I said I'm perfectly healthy, I have no crippling disabilities, I have nothing that is stopping me from doing work, but I don't think any of these jobs are the most important thing I can do with my time on this planet. I don't think the biggest problem in the world is that there's not enough mediocre coffee being made and I should go make more mediocre coffee at one of the 15 coffee shops in town. That's not I want to, meditate on the glories of the universe. That would be, I would be outside the scope of the Greens policy.
You would be outside the scope of the current Greens policy. As I say, I am working towards a UBI model where it is universally, applied, and you don't even have to even talk about it. The current model is not that. The current policy model is not that yet.
I'm going to steal the last question. There is a chance that the Greens will hold the balance of power in the current government. If that's the case, there will be a limited number of items that you will be able to force through potentially from that position. Where is the minimum income, the livable income guarantee in priority list on that list? Is it number 2 or 1, or is it number 5 or 7, or where is it? Can you give us a number? What's it more important than?
So
Sophie's choice, Tim.
The Greens announced a list of 7 key priorities the other day that would be top of our list in negotiating balance of power. Raising the rate of income support was on that list. Not the full livable income guarantee, in the same way, for instance, that a moratorium on all new coal, oil and gas was on that list, not our full climate policy. So part of it is in our absolute top priorities, but not the full LIG yet. But it's, again, it's about how you prioritize which bits and pieces and how you negotiate that.
And I'd like to finish up just by reminding everyone what Noam Chomsky says about elections. is that they're important, but they're a very small part of living in a democracy. So cast your vote and don't waste too much time on it. Stay active, and you can do that by getting involved with Basic Income Australia, where we welcome members of all parties, so long as they support the abolition of poverty. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Tim. Great episode. Glad everyone could make it.
Thanks. Good night.
Thanks,
Thank
Austin.
you.
Thank you very much,
everybody.
Austin,
Thanks
Tim,
for organising, Austin,
And
and good night, everybody.
Andrea, Michael.
Thanks, guys.